two and a bit years, the previous government was unable to find a solution.
Grangemouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the Northern Ireland Secretary's response just there, why is this Labour government continue to undermine the tough action taken by the Conservative government on individuals who have acted against our democracy and society, such as Gerry Adams, by considering repealing the Legacy Act, giving him and others the possibility of a six-figure payout?
Well, as I've indicated to the House at the last Northern Ireland oral questions, nobody wants to see that happen. We are currently working to find a lawful way of dealing with the problems that were created by the way in which the original interim custody orders were signed in 1972 and I think 1973, which the Supreme Court in 2020 found, where they were not signed and considered by the Secretary of State, were not lawful.
Louise.
In 2019, Boris Johnson commissioned the Shawcross report into Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism. US citizens have received compensation from the Libyan government for attacks on British soil, but UK citizens never have. Will the Secretary of State work with the FCDO to ensure that the Shawcross report is published?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and the whole House will have profound sympathy for all the victims of Gaddafi-sponsored IRA terrorism and all the victims of the Troubles. The Shawcross report was commissioned by the previous government as an internal report, and decisions on the report and its future are currently under review by the FCDO.
Go through, yes. Shadow Minister Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People right across the United Kingdom will be disgusted if former terrorists like Gerry Adams get compensation from the taxpayer because of Labour's decision to repeal the Legacy Act without putting something in its place. Will the Secretary of State finally commit to legislating immediately to prevent this from happening?
Well, I refer the honourable gentleman to the answer I gave a moment ago on that issue.
Right. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. We start with Dr. Luke Evans.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week marked 3 years since Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. The courage of the Ukrainians is inspiring, and across this House we stand with them for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, that's why we're increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by April 2027, with an ambition to reach 3% in the next Parliament as economic and fiscal conditions allow. And this afternoon, of course, I will travel to the US to have discussions with President Trump about the enduring security partnership between our two countries. Mr. Speaker, I'm also delighted that we've announced the first 750 schools to start offering free breakfast clubs. This is our plan for change in action, ensuring every child has the chance to thrive. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in thanking Amanda Pritchard for her services as Chief Executive of the NHS England, and I wish her well for the future. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Luca.
Could the Prime Minister tell this House whether the outcome of his budget was by design or by mistake? Did he mean to push 100,000 pensioners into poverty with his own analysis when he removed the winter fuel allowance, or was that a mistake? Did he mean to decimate family farming when he changed the inheritance tax, or was that a mistake? And did he mean to tax GPs, care homes and hospices when he raised NICs, or was that a mistake? Prime Minister, could he tell the House, are these acceptable collateral damage in his path for change, or simply a mistake that need rectifying?
I'll tell you what was a mistake, leaving a £22 billion black hole that we had to sort out. We took the difficult decisions, investing in our NHS, and I would have thought he would have welcomed the 2 million extra appointments that we've achieved in the first 7 months of a Labour government. That's the difference our budget is making to people.
Alex McIntyre.
Delighted that Calton and Grange primary schools in my city of Gloucester will be part of the first 750 schools to get free breakfast clubs. And I'm pleased that this government is already delivering on its manifesto promises in less than a year. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that by helping working parents with childcare and delivering the best start to the day for every single child, we are delivering opportunity for the next generation?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. We're pleased that 2 of the early adopter schools will be in his constituency. Mr Speaker, we're ensuring that all primary school children aged can get access to free breakfast and at least 30 minutes of free childcare. And that means every child ready to learn, and parents, of course, supported with up to £450 a year back in their pockets. That's the change a Labour government makes.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I wish the Prime Minister every success on his trip to Washington. The visit to see President Trump must serve our national interest. The Prime Minister and I are completely united in our support for Ukraine as a proud and sovereign nation. Yeah. What specific steps will he take to ensure Ukraine is at the negotiating table for any peace settlement?
Well, I thank her for her words about the forthcoming trip. And it is right, and I think the whole House will think it's right, that Ukraine must be at the table at negotiations. There can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. That has been my consistent position in all of the discussions that I've had. That will continue to be my position, because this is about the sovereignty of Ukraine and their ability to decide for themselves the future of their country. So they must be at the table.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, and as I said, I wish him every success. We want to support him on this issue. So turning to the details of the plan he set out yesterday. Over the weekend, I suggested to the Prime Minister that he cut the aid budget, and I'm pleased that he accepted my advice. Mr Speaker, it's the fastest response. It's the fastest response I've ever had from the Prime Minister. However, he announced £13.4 billion in additional defence spending yesterday. This morning, his Defence Secretary said the uplift is only £6 billion, which is the correct figure.
Prime Minister.
I'm going to have to let the Leader of the Opposition down gently. She didn't feature in my thinking at all. I was so busy over the weekend I didn't even see her proposal. I think she's appointed herself, I think, saviour of the Western civilization. It's a desperate search for relevance. But, Mr Speaker, look, if you take the numbers for this financial year and then the numbers for the financial year 27-28, that's £13.4 billion increase. That is the largest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, which will put us in a position to ensure the security and defence of our country and of Europe.
Mr Speaker, that wasn't very clear. How is it that the Defence Secretary says £6 billion and he says £13.4 billion? The IFS said today that the government is playing silly games with numbers. How does he find this difference in numbers?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we went through this 2 weeks ago, going through the same question over and over again. So let me say it. If you take the financial year this year, and then you take the financial year for 2027-28, the difference between the two is £13.4 billion. That's the same answer. If you ask again, I'll give the same answer again.
I'll decide when it's more.
Mr Speaker, someone needs to tell the Prime Minister that being patronising is not a substitute. For answering questions. It's not a substitute. He hasn't answered. What he has said is different from what he said yesterday. We are still not clear where the money is coming from. We want to support him. He's also said that we should put British troops on the ground in Ukraine. We haven't seen the detail of any proposals. Would his new spending plans allow him to fund this commitment effectively?
Prime Minister.
I mean, I think it's the same question again. It's 13.4 billion. That's the difference between this year and 2020. She asked a serious question about the security guarantees in Ukraine, and that is extremely important, because the worst of all outcomes, if there's to be a cessation of hostilities, is that it is a short break rather than sustained and lasting peace. And I think that that means there's got to be security guarantees. I've indicated that we will play our full part. There has to be US backing, because otherwise I don't think it will deter Putin. We are working on that. I'm having extensive discussions about it, not in a position to put details before the House, as she well knows today, but I'll continue down that route, because I want a lasting peace in Ukraine and Europe for the safety and security of Ukrainians, of Europeans, and of course for everybody in this country.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, this is an endeavour that we want to support him in, but we need to know exactly what it is we're supporting. We need clarity and transparency over the money. We also need to know where this money is going. This morning, the Defence Secretary could not say if the Chagos deal would come out of the defence budget. Can he confirm to the House that none of the defence uplift includes payments for his Chagos deal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the additional spend I announced yesterday is for our capability on defence and security in Europe, as I made absolutely clear yesterday. The Chagos deal is extremely important for our security, for US security. The US are rightly looking at it. When it's finalised, I'll put it before the House with the costings. The figures being bandied around are absolutely wild of the mark. The deal is well over a century, but the funding I announced yesterday is for our capability to put ourselves in a position to rise to a generational challenge. That is what that money is all about, and I thought she supported it.
Kemi Badenoch.
Speaker, we need to make sure we are supporting a plan that is clear and transparent. Yesterday, the Prime Minister set an ambition for defence spending to reach 3% in the next Parliament. We agree with him, but this could be 2034, almost a decade away. That is too slow. We don't know how he will pay for it. We cannot raise taxes further. We already pay more on debt interest than defence, and everyone in this House would have heard him not answer the last question. So I will ask him again. Is he paying for the Chagos deal with this defence uplift or not?
Prime Minister.
I've just dealt with that question. She gave her... The money announced yesterday is going to our capability to put ourselves in a position to defend the security of our country, Europe and the UK. And she asked about defence spending. She gave what people have described as a rambling speech yesterday when she couldn't say what defence spending should be. We've been absolutely clear. We've set it out, a full, credible, costed plan, and I thought she supported it.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that in coastal communities like mine in East Thanet, people develop cancer earlier, get treated and diagnosed later, and die younger. Can he give the House an update on the plans for the government to implement the recommendations by the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, into tackling poor health in our seaside towns?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this. She's right that cancer patients are waiting too long for diagnosis and for treatment. Addressing healthcare inequity is part of our 10-year health plan, Mr. Speaker, aiming to halve the gap in healthy life expectancy between the richest and the poorest regions. And we're making progress on that already.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by wishing the Prime Minister well on his trip to the White House. It won't be an easy meeting, but we're all behind him for our national interest. But it's already clear that under President Trump, we won't be able to rely on the United States, sadly, to help ensure our security against Russian aggression. And that's why we strongly welcome the Prime Minister's decision to increase Britain's defence spending. But Europe must do far more to rearm in the face of Putin's threat, and the UK must lead on that. That's why we back the idea of a new European rearmament bank, so we can finance a big increase in the manufacturing capacity without the need to cut Britain's vital soft power. So will the Prime Minister look at this idea, work across this House and across Europe, so we can make a European rearmament bank actually happen?
Prime Minister.
I'll resist his suggestion that we've got somehow to choose between the US and our European partners. I do not believe that to be the case. And I want to strengthen our already strong relationship with the US, because I think it's vital that we do so. I, of course, want to work with our European allies on defence capability and what more we need to do in relation to capability, coordination and funding. And in the longer term, there is a discussion going on amongst allies as to future funding. We're part of that discussion, and I'm happy to share that with the House as it evolves.
Sir Ed Davey.
I hope he's successful in keeping the US on board with our European allies, and I'm glad he's talking about finance and defence. I think if he was to push this European Rearmament Bank at the summit on Sunday, the European leaders, I think he'd be pushing an open door. Certainly Prime Minister Tusk is supporting from the Polish point of view. But Mr Speaker, if I can turn now to domestic matters and the cost of living crisis that's hitting so many of our constituents. Families in my constituency are really angry that Thames Water is sending them bills this April that will cost them £150 a year more. Thames has already let down so many people, whether it's leaking pipes or pumping their filthy sewage into our rivers. A third of customers' bills are already used just to pay the interest on Thames Water's debt, and now it's going to borrow £3 billion more. Isn't it time to stop making people pay for bailing out the vulture funds drowning Thames Water in debt? Will his government just put this firm out of its misery, put it into special administration so we can sort out that mess and the mess that lot left?
Well, he's certainly right about the mess that lot made. We've obviously got the water bill. It's got very strong measures in it, and I think he supports them.
Dr. Rosanna Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. We have heard extraordinary rhetoric coming out of Washington in recent days, and we have seen fascist salutes on our screens. We have witnessed wild statements about Palestinians being expelled from Gaza, and we have seen our allies labelled dictators. Britain's interests are best served by standing with Ukraine, working closely with our European allies, by upholding international law and remaining a strong part of NATO. Can the Prime Minister assure us that this will form a central part of his message when he meets world leaders this week?
Minister.
Well, we certainly stand with Ukraine, and I think I speak for the whole House when I say that. And as I set out yesterday, NATO is the bedrock of our security. It's been our most important alliance for many, many years, as important today as it's ever been. And we build that alliance by working with the US. We have a special and deep relationship with the US. That's not just words, that's to do with security, defence, intelligence capability, vitally important for both sides. But we also work with our European allies, and it is that ability to work with the US and the EU and European partners that has held the peace for so many years and needs to hold the peace for many years to come.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Prior to the election, the Labour Party promised to reduce energy bills by £300, yet on their watch, energy bills are about to increase by almost £300. So may I ask, is the failure to keep that promise a consequence of government incompetency, or have the Labour Party been caught lying to the public?
Hear, hear. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we're very proud of the fact that we are pushing forward for energy independence, which will keep our bills lower. And he knows very well what my position is. But I note that, again, he's very quiet on the SNP record. And I'll tell you for why. Just this week, we've seen the attainment gap widen in Scotland, pupils leaving schools with no qualifications rising, those from deprived areas going to work falling. Instead of playing the politics of grievance, they need to take responsibility for their own record.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent Mike Addison was one of a kind, a physical disability rugby league world champion with England and Warrington Wolves, and an avid volunteer for the club and foundation. He was a friend to everyone who knew him. Tragically, he died at age 45, having taken his own life. One death by suicide is too many, and every suicide is preventable. But ONS data puts the rate in the North West at over double the rate of London, and with a 17% increase last year. So can the Prime Minister outline what more can be done working across government to help Warrington meet our target of eliminating suicide?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank her for raising this tragic case? And my thoughts, I'm sure the thoughts of the House, are with the family, friends and teammates of Mike at Warrington Wolves. I mean, she's right, Mr. Speaker, that one death by suicide is one too many, and reducing the number is a vital part of our health mission. We are recruiting an additional 8,500 mental health workers, especially trained to support people at risk of suicide. We're committed to taking forward the suicide prevention strategy for England. I'm sure this is something the whole House will support.
Dr Neil Batts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement committing us to increased defence spending and reaffirming the UK's support for Ukraine and their democratically elected leader, President Zelensky. A wartime leader, like Winston Churchill, who also had to delay elections because his country faced an existential threat. As the Prime Minister travels to Washington, with this House and the country willing him to succeed, will he invoke the legacy of Churchill in making the case for the UK to be the key in bridging transatlantic relations, to bring us all together for the sake of freedom and democracy across the world?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his question. Can I pick up on both elements? Because President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader, and suspending elections was precisely what we did in this country when we were fighting in the Second World War. And secondly, on his point, yes, I do think that the UK has successfully been a bridge between the US and Europe for many, many years. It's vital that we continue in that role, and that's why my message to President Trump is that the relationship between our two countries needs to go from strength to strength. It's all very strong, but also working at the same time with our European allies.
Jessica T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday night, there was a brutal double stabbing in my constituency. This adds to a long line of horrific knife attacks that have included 3 fatalities over the past 2 years. I know the Prime Minister is aware of the particular challenges we face in Bournemouth, and while crime has been going down, I know there is much more he will want to do. So will he join me in praising the crucial work that organisations like Changes Are Made, who give positive activities like boxing to young people, and will he share what more the government can do to tackle knife crime in communities like mine?
Prime Minister.
Thank you for raising this really important issue. Yesterday we introduced our crime and policing bill, which is central to our plan for change and halving knife crime. It involves new powers to seize and destroy knives found on private property and a new criminal offence of possessing a bladed article with intent to cause harm. Plus, Mr. Speaker, tougher penalties for selling dangerous weapons to under-18s, stricter rules for online sales under Ronan's law, and we'll continue with that work.
Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The floods of 2013-14 devastated Datchet, Horton and Wraysbury, and the flooding last January wasn't much better. But shockingly, the River Thames scheme as currently proposed continues to leave my constituents at risk. The Council was asked to cough up tens of millions, but like very many, is cash-strapped. Does the Prime Minister, therefore, agree with me that the only option to protect my constituents is funding Channel 1 of the River Thames scheme as the national strategic infrastructure, which it really is?
Prime Minister.
Well, I know the honourable member has raised this issue before, and it's obviously an important issue for his constituents. We inherited flood defences in their worst state on record, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're investing £2.6 billion to protect over 50,000 properties. I understand that the options to reduce flood risk to these communities are being considered as part of the Datchet and Hythe End flood alleviation scheme, and I'll ensure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister to take forward the work.
Sally Jameson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order for the government's growth agenda to be a success, it must be felt in all areas of the country, including Doncaster and South Yorkshire, where we have green growth transport companies, including hybrid air vehicles and clean power hydrogen, alongside the reopening of Doncaster-Sheffield Airport. So will the Prime Minister put on his record support for Mayor Ros Jones, who has led on the airport reopening, and also set out how the growth agenda will override those traditional patterns of investment mainly in the south of England and bring prosperity to South Yorkshire and indeed the north as a whole?
Yes, I will. Doncaster's got a proud industrial heritage, rail, steel and coal, an extraordinary potential for industries of the future from hydrogen to AI. And we are focused, Mr Speaker, on devolving more power and funding to metro mayors to support regional industry. And we will work with the mayors of Doncaster and South Yorkshire to support efforts to reopen Doncaster-Sheffield Airport.
Graham Lambitter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have the privilege to represent the home of Speyside malts, some amongst the finest Scotch whiskies. Last week, the UK Government unveiled damaging plans to grant a different definition of single malt to English producers to that of Scottish single malts. This is entirely inconsistent with the global reputation of the quality of single malts and seeks to tear up a well-established definition of what a single malt is, pulling the rug yet further from underneath the Scotch whisky industry. Given the backlash from the industry to this and the damage this could cause to Scotch whisky exports and jobs, will the Prime Minister's word on whisky be his whisky bond by backing the industry to the hilt and scrapping these plans?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we do support Scotch whisky. It's a really important part of our economy, and that's why we allocated £5 million in the budget and why we're working with Brazil, which is worth £25 million for Scotch whisky. It's what we're doing to support industry and sectors in Scotland. And in addition to that, in another sector, at the weekend I was very pleased to be able to announce the £200 million investment in Grangemouth and the future for generations there.
Steve Brace.
Speaker, yesterday I returned from Ukraine, having spent 4 days with a cross-party delegation of parliamentarians. The Ukrainians we met from across society had one simple message. They were deeply thankful for our partnership, and they want us to know that they can overcome the Russian invasion because they must. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that alongside our welcome 100-year partnership, now is the time for the UK to redouble our efforts alongside our European partners to help secure Ukraine's future as a free, democratic and sovereign European nation?
Yes, I do, and I'm really proud of the way the United Kingdom has risen to the challenge of the last 3 years in a united way, both in terms of the capability and funding that we provided to Ukraine, but also the throwing open of homes here for those fleeing. And I was privileged to welcome some of the families to Downing Street on Monday, and it was a human reminder of the impact that it's having on them, their children and their families.
Dr Kieran Millen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The whole House wants the Prime Minister's meeting with President Trump to be a success, which requires credibility on our defence spending commitments. The Leader of the Opposition gave the Prime Minister an opportunity to unambiguously rule out the funding of any Chagas deal coming from the defence budget, and I'm not clear that he did that. I want him to be taken seriously in Washington, so I'll make it really easy for him. Will he rule out the funding of any Chagas deal coming from the defence budget, yes or no?
Yes. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I said, when the deal is complete, I will put it before the House with the costings. The money yesterday was allocated to our capability, the single biggest increase, sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War.
Diane Abbott.
The whole country stands behind the people of Ukraine. But there is also a view that taking money from aid and development to spend on armaments and tanks makes people less safe, not more safe, because the desperation and the poverty that so often leads to warfare is what aid and development money is supposed to counter.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I said yesterday, the overseas development is important. I'm proud of what we've done. It wasn't a decision I took lightly or I wanted to take, but it is important at this moment that we put the defence spending, the defence and security of our country and Europe uppermost. We will, of course, make sure that we're able to fulfil our humanitarian obligations in relation to Gaza, Ukraine and Sudan, and other vital work. And I want to be clear that we do, of course, want to go back and increase that funding as soon as we're able to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Prime Minister knows that when he does travel to Washington to meet the former leader of the free world, he does so with the hopes and prayers of this House and the country. Probably no more serious a meeting could be taking place. Now, whilst Ukraine will clearly dominate, will the Prime Minister undertake to raise with President Trump that Canada is a valued, respected and much-loved member of both NATO and our Commonwealth, and that this childish nonsense of a 51st state should be called out by the Prime Minister for what it is?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this issue. UK and Canada are close allies and have been for a very long time, with a partnership based on a shared history and a shared set of values, and a determination to be an active force for good in the world. We work closely with them on issues of the Commonwealth, on NATO and, of course, Five Eyes, intelligence sharing, and we will work to strengthen that relationship.
Michelle Scrockham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Barrow-in-Furness has always been ahead of the times in terms of high-skilled engineering. In light of the Prime Minister's historic commitment to rise defence spending, the biggest increase since the end of the Cold War, I invite him to visit and see the many SMEs who can support this vital supply chain. Does he agree that investing in these businesses will not only deliver our nuclear deterrent, but improve security and the economy for us all?
Well, I thank her for raising this question, and we'll obviously consider her invitation. Defence spending, Mr. Speaker, already supports more than 430,000 jobs across the United Kingdom, and I'd like to recognise the contribution made by the workers in Barrow-in-Furness.
Wendy Morton.
Mr. Speaker, in my constituency, the planning inspector chose to use the term grey belt to pass a battery energy storage system application before the order was laid in this House to change the NPPF, and without recognising the moratorium for local authorities to manage their local plans. This decision failed to recognise the green belt that protects us against urban sprawl, and it failed to recognise the proximity to a school, a church and a graveyard. So can the Prime Minister define what grey belt actually is, or is it simply a grey area to allow for inappropriate development?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not across the details of the individual case that she raises, as she will understand, but I am in favour of making sure that we can have the infrastructure and the houses that we need to grow our economy. And one of the problems we had in the last 14 years was an assertion or rhetoric that we wanted homes and infrastructure, but when the decision all that came up, the answer was always no. The answer cannot always be no.
John McDonnell.
Can I thank the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for their efforts to secure the release of Allah Abdel Fattah, the human rights campaigner, the British human rights campaigner, who's been imprisoned in Egypt now for over 10 years. The Prime Minister will know, because he's met the family, that his mother is on the 150th day of her hunger strike and her health is failing rapidly. Could I ask the Prime Minister to pick up the phone to President Sisi and seek the release of Allah to save his life, also that of his mother's?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this really important case, and as he says, I did meet the mother and the family just a few days ago, and it is an incredibly difficult situation for them, and I can assure him I will do everything I can to ensure the release in this case, and that includes phone calls as necessary. I've raised it before, I'll raise it again, we raise it and will continue to do so. I gave my word to the family that that's what I do, that I will do, and I will.
Hannah.
People in Northern Ireland are sick to the teeth of paramilitaries, of the menace, of the sectarianism and of keeping people stuck in the past. In light of the announcement yesterday on transition, does the Prime Minister recognise that people will be highly sceptical of this process, that there must be real learnings from the failed transitions of the past, that there can be no rewards for paramilitaries for hanging on, robust criminal justice, the flags off the lampposts and on street corners, and community-funded policing to allow communities that have been brutalised by paramilitaries to finally look forward to a confident and shared future?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for raising this important and obviously sensitive issue? We are committed to making progress towards ending paramilitarism once and for all in Northern Ireland, and that's why we've agreed to support a short independent exercise to look at a formal process, and I'll make sure that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland keeps her updated.
Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, prostate cancer is now our country's most common cancer, and yet there is no national screening programme. We made progress towards this in government, but yet there is more to do, which is why I'm delighted to have joined Prostate Cancer Research, the charity, as an ambassador. I'm grateful to the Health Secretary for his engagement thus far, and could I ask the Prime Minister to ensure that we do have a targeted national screening programme for the most at-risk groups of prostate cancer, so that we can not only save the NHS money, make progress towards the government's early diagnosis targets, but most crucially, save thousands of lives?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for raising this, and can I thank him for using his authority and reputation to support this vital cause, which will make a material difference, and I look forward to working with him on it. We do share a commitment to detecting prostate cancer earlier and treating it faster, and we must do that. Our National Cancer Plan will improve the way we treat cancer right across the country, and I'll make sure he's fully informed of the steps that we're taking, and we'll work with him.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join with me in wishing all Welsh citizens everywhere a very happy St David's Day on Saturday? And will he also join with me in welcoming the latest news of the £600 million investment by Copenhagen infrastructure partners to ensure that Bute Energy and Green Gen Cymru can take forward the bold ambition to achieve 100% green electricity production by 2035 in Wales, thus providing much-needed sustainable green jobs for the people of Wales?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I wish her and her constituents a very happy St David's Day and join her in welcoming this significant new investment into her constituency that will ensure good jobs, well-paid, skilled jobs, and, of course, the transition to energy security and lower bills. And I know her constituency will play a vital role in that.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that our biggest single foreign policy priority is the preservation of NATO with America at its heart? And if so, following his welcome announcement yesterday, is the next step to talk to our European allies and for all of us to agree to spend 3% of GDP on defence within a specified timescale, so that we can look the President in the eye and say that Europe is finally pulling its weight on defence?
Prime Minister.
Well, I agree with him entirely in terms of the priority in terms of NATO. Putin thought he could weaken NATO. He's only made it stronger and larger. NATO's strength comes from the US and European partners and others working together, and that is absolutely the focus of my work at the moment. It is right, as he says, that European countries, including the United Kingdom, do need to do more on capability, on coordination, and on defence spend. That must be not seen as a project separate to NATO, but part of an essential project that ensures that NATO is there for decades and decades to come, preserving the peace, just as it has been for 75 years.
Final question, Newman Steinbeck.
Mr. Speaker, the Grangemouth refinery closure has loomed over central Scotland since Petronas's announcement in November 2023. 2 weeks ago, Scottish Labour colleagues and I met with the National Wealth Fund to make the case for investment in Grangemouth. I strongly welcome the exceptional commitment this Labour government has shown to Grangemouth by committing £200 million from the National Wealth Fund. Can I ask the Prime Minister what steps the government will be taking to secure permanent, good jobs at Grangemouth?
Well, can I thank him for being such a great champion for Scotland and his constituency? Mr. Speaker, Grangemouth is really important to communities in Scotland, to the economy in Scotland. It's not a charity case. It's got incredible potential, huge opportunity, and that's why at the weekend I was very pleased to announce £200 million from the National Wealth Fund to incentivise private investment. That, of course, Mr. Speaker, follows £100 million in the growth deal that we announced earlier. This is about jobs for decades to come in Grangemouth. It's a really exciting opportunity, and we intend to seize it.
I hope His Presidency of the Assembly of North Macedonia, His Excellency Mr Afrim Gasha, enjoyed questions. Right, that completes PMQs. Right, let us come to the 10-minute rule motion. Or statement. What is it? Right, let's come to the statement on housing communities and local government. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government accepts that the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry must be the catalyst for long-lasting systemic change. All members of the House, past and present, will have shared my anger over its shocking findings. The inquiry chair, Sir Martin Morbick, and his dedicated team uncovered damning evidence of political, corporate and individual failings going back decades. These led to the loss of 72 innocent lives. 18 of them were children. On that terrible night in June 2017. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was a deadly betrayal, a national tragedy that must never happen again. I will repeat today what the Prime Minister said in September. To bereave families, the survivors, and those in the immediate Grenfell community, and some of whom are with us today in the gallery, on behalf of the government, the British state, and those responsible, I am very sorry. The inquiry report made 58 recommendations, of which 37 were directed at the government. The government accepts the findings of the report and will take forward all the recommendations. Our response, published today, addresses each in turn and goes further to set out our wider reforms of social housing and on the construction sector. As we make these vital changes, we will publish quarterly reports on the progress and update Parliament annually. The government is open to scrutiny and will remain accountable for its actions. We will prioritise residents and protect their interests and make sure that industry builds safe homes and provide clearer accountability and enforcement. To have anyone, anywhere, living in an unsafe home is one person too many. That will be our guiding principle and must be that of anyone who wants to build or care for our homes. That will be an important part of the legacy of Grenfell. Madam Deputy Speaker, for nearly 8 years, despite their pain, the bereaved, survivors and members of the community have campaigned with determination, not wanting anyone to suffer as they have. And it is fair to say that the building system that we have today is not the same as the one
that was justly criticised in the report, the one we had leading up to the tragic events of 2017. But it is also clear that there is still much more to do. So I can announce that we will create a single construction regulator and a chief construction advisor, and we'll set out our detailed plans later this year. And I am accepting the recommendations to professionalise fire engineers and assessors, to licence principal contractors and to review the role of building control. Where standards are clear and industry has clarity and certainty on how individuals and firms must behave, it encourages investor confidence. And this will improve the safety of residents, support the construction industry and our mission to deliver economic growth. We have pledged to build 1.5 million homes over the Parliament to tackle our country's acute housing crisis, part of our plan for change to improve the lives of people across the country. And it is vital that these future homes, as well as existing homes, are safe and of a high quality. And I welcome how some parts of the industry have stepped up to lead the necessary change in culture and approach. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, lest we forget. Sir Martin found that just about every institution and organisation charged with keeping the tower safe and protecting those who called it home failed. His most devastating conclusion was that every single death was avoidable. The inquiry uncovered serial incompetence and negligence, complacency and inaction, and blatant dishonesty and greed. The organisations that failed included the government and regulators. The department that I now lead, which failed to act on known risks and ignored, delayed or disregarded matters affecting the safety of life. And the manufacturing companies, including Arcanic, Kingspan and Celotex, whose products were used to refurbish the tower, the report found that they acted with systemic dishonesty and they missold and they marketed them. Their disgraceful mercenary behaviour put profit before people and exploited the regulatory regime to evade accountability with fatal consequences. And to my disgust and their shame, some have shown little remorse and have refused to even help fix the building safety crisis that they did so much to create. Companies must be held to account for their role in Grenfell. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Cabinet Office is announcing today that she will use new powers under the Procurement Act to investigate Arconic, Kingspan, Saint-Aubin as owners of Celotex at the time and other organisations. And I expect swift, decisive action and will ensure progress is reported. But we must do more to make sure that the right rules are in place. To this day, critical gaps persist in how construction products are regulated. Only with rigorous reform will we transform the culture that allowed the tragedy to happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, to achieve this, we are also publishing today a Construction Products Reform Green Paper. It will help us to cut out the rot in the sector and allow competence to take root. Safety will come first and a culture of responsibility will prevail. We will celebrate those that lead the way and those that fall short will suffer the consequences. In the future, road companies will be held to account. Our Green Paper sets out our ideas for how prison time for executives who break the rules and unlimited fines where safety is put at risk. We will do whatever it takes. Across the sector, we know that there is appetite for change. That change is overdue, and we will lead it. I've paid tribute to the enduring resilience and resolve of the bereaved families and the survivors and members of the immediate community. Their campaigning has seen new legislation passed which members of this government also supported that has made our public realm more secure. Everyone is safer thanks to the Building Safety Act, which set new standards for construction of residential buildings in England. It introduced the Building Safety Regulator and provisions for high-risk buildings. All people living in flats now know that the entrance doors, external walls and structure of their homes are in scope of fire risk assessments, thanks to the Fire Safety Act. There are new duties for owners and managers of buildings and blocks of flats. The Social Housing Act ensures that landlords are held to account. I have challenged the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to demonstrate how they have changed by becoming an exemplar landlord and local authority. And I'll be keeping a close eye on their progress. And we will listen to their tenants to assess whether they have succeeded. We are pushing ahead with the remediation acceleration plan to fix all buildings around the country still with dangerous cladding, and where building owners fall short, we will act. We are introducing regulations to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable residents in high-rise and higher-risk residential buildings. And as of the 1st of April, ministerial responsibilities for fire functions will move from the Home Office to my department, in line with the inquiry's recommendation that we bring responsibility for fire safety into a single government department. Madam Deputy Speaker, people and their safety are front and centre of our inquiry response. But there remains a stark and terrible reality. The bereaved and the survivors and members of the Grenfell community are still waiting for the justice they need and deserve. And justice must be done. Madam Deputy Speaker, the ongoing Metropolitan Police investigation is amongst the biggest it has ever undertaken, and the Met has the government's full support. In September, the Prime Minister rightly said that this tragedy posed questions about what social justice means in Britain today, whether the voices of working-class people, those with disabilities, those of colour are ignored and dismissed. I am here to say that we will not be that country. We will be a country where decent housing, where security, where safety, where peace of mind are shared by all and not just the privilege of a few. The lessons of this inquiry should not have taken a tragedy to unearth. We will honour the memory of those who lost their lives by bringing about meaningful change in their name, change that will make life better for everyone. We are under no illusions about the scale of the task at hand. The responsibility to deliver lasting change is the privilege of leadership. This will not be done by government alone, but we will put our voice and our power in the service and the cause that the Grenfell community has continued to fight for nearly 8 long years. We will together bring about the transformational change that people of this country deserve. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it is with that admiration for their spirit and the determination to honour it that I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Minister, Kevin Holleray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for advance sight of her statements and the Government's response to the Phase 2 report. Can I begin by echoing the sentiments of the Deputy Prime Minister shared across this House? The tragedy of Grenfell, which claimed 72 innocent lives, 54 adults and 18 children, will always remain a scar on our national conscience. Can I thank Sir Martin Morbick and his team for their work? And can I join with the Deputy Prime Minister in offering my deepest apologies to the bereaved, the survivors and the Grenfell community for the failures that led to that horrific night in June 2017, a night where we all remember where we were. Can I also thank them for their constant and constructive campaigning? The inquiry's findings, decades of systemic failure, dishonesty and negligence, are a damning indictment of successive governments, regulators and industry. The government's response, with its acceptance of all 58 recommendations, is a step forward, and I welcome the commitment to action. The creation of a single construction regulator, the appointment of a chief construction advisor, and the consolidation of fire safety functions under one department are long overdue reforms. So too is the focus on professionalising fire engineers and reforming the construction product sector, a sector the inquiry exposed as riddled with systemic dishonesty from firms like Arconic, Kingspan and Celotex. The Green Paper on construction products reform is a promising start, but it must deliver real accountability. Unlimited fines and prison sentences for rogue executives and, where appropriate, government officials cannot remain mere rhetoric. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, ambition must be matched by urgency and scrutiny. Nearly 8 years have passed since Grenfell, yet thousands still live in buildings with unsafe cladding and other fire safety defects. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, although I welcome the fact she's accepted the majority of these recommendations, can I ask her why she has not accepted the inquiry's recommendation for the single regulator to oversee testing and certification of construction products, leaving this instead with conformity assessment bodies? Can I remind her that the Building Research Establishment, itself a conformity assessment body, was strongly criticised for having its own conflicts of interest? The Remediation Acceleration Plan is welcome, but its targets, assessing all buildings by July 2025 and completing works by 2027, rely heavily on developers stepping up voluntarily. What actions will she take if they do not comply? Will she work to deliver solutions for non-qualifying leaseholders and those at risk as a consequence of other fire safety defects? This House needs concrete assurances that no resident will be left behind. I question the phased approach to implementation, stretching beyond 2028. Justice delayed is justice denied, and the Grenfell community has waited long enough for change. Why must they potentially wait another parliamentary term for full delivery? What discussions has the Leader of House had with parliamentary colleagues on the establishment of Public Inquiry's Joint Committee to monitor the implementation of Public Inquiry recommendations? What is the timetable for new publicly available record on all inquiry recommendations since 2024? On social housing, the extension of AWAB's law and new standards are positive, but the government must go further to address the inquiry's wider lessons. Residents' voices were ignored. Tenant empowerment must be more than a panel or a campaign. It needs legal teeth to ensure landlords act on concerns swiftly. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, justice demands accountability. The Metropolitan Police investigation has our full support, but the pace must quicken. Those who profited from cutting corners or who were criminally negligent must face consequences, not just fines, but criminal charges where evidence allows. Grenfell must be a watershed, a legacy of safety, transparency and respect for every resident. Can I make clear our commitment to work with her and her government on a cross-party basis to meet that promise?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for his comments and the way in which he made them, and I hope genuinely that we can work together to continue this piece of work. I recognised in my opening statement the work of the previous government with the Building Safety Act and other measures, and we will continue to work in that vein. I hope the honourable member recognises some of the work we're already doing. We've brought forward a significant amount of legislation around social tenancy, around empowering tenants in the Renters' Rights Bill, around leasehold, how we can protect leaseholders, and our remediation acceleration plan. The government will deliver these legislative changes as soon as parliamentary time allows, and the legislation commitments are detailed in the plan, and that will include creating certainty for buildings that need remediating and who is responsible for remediating them, make obligations for assessing and completing regulation remediation clearer with severe consequences for non-compliance, and give residents greater control in situations of acute harm where landlords have neglected their responsibilities. The Shadow Secretary of State asked me about single construction regulator. We did accept that in principle, but the single regulator will deliver the functions recommended by the inquiry with 2 exceptions to avoid conflicts of interest by both setting the rules for construction products and policing its own compliance. But we will consult on the design of the regulator in the autumn.
Yeah. I call the Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Shalami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by recognising that today is yet another long, exhausting day for the loved ones of the victims of Grenfell, who are still having to fight for justice nearly 8 years on. I welcome the Secretary of State's response, and I look forward to the Select Committee scrutinising the proposals for the single construction regulator and the Green Paper. But if we're honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Secretary of State has outlined won't tackle the root cause of the systematic ignorance of concerns of tenants, that toxic stigma which is at the heart of our social housing sector. Can the Secretary of State outline what steps she's taken to make sure that tenants have a voice in the social housing sector and the respect when they raise concerns for their families? Madam Deputy Speaker, we must never forget that 41% of the victims of Grenfell were disabled, a figure which underlines the collective failure of the system to protect those in need. The government's commitment to residential evacuation plans for disabled people in high-rise buildings is a welcome step forward, but I'd be grateful for some clarity from the Secretary of State on how the government intends to make residential PEEPs enforceable if the responsible person fails to identify the vulnerable resident. I'm also pleased that funding has been allocated for this in the social sector. But the reality is disabled people live in all types of housing. So can she give a commitment in her response that disabled people in the private rented sector will have the same access for an evacuation plan to those in the social sector? I'll close, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that none of the families in the gallery should be here today. This tragedy happened in the holy month of Ramadan in 2017. As Ramadan approaches this week, a time that should be dedicated to reflection, to healing, togetherness, too many families are still fighting for justice. No family member present today should have to spend their time demanding accountability when they should be focused on recovering on that trauma. I pay tribute to their tireless effort and pledge to continue to be a voice for them in their fight for justice without any more delay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as Chair of the Housing, Community and Local Committee, I know my honourable friend's commitment to the rights of social housing tenants. The social housing system, as she outlines, has not been fit for purpose, and these failings contributed to the Grenfell tragedy. We're driving up standards in social housing through stronger regulation and enforcement measures, strengthening tenants' voice and improving access to redress. These reforms will ensure landlords are held accountable for the quality of homes and services that they provide. And at the heart of the new regulatory regime is the requirement that all landlords treat tenants with fairness and respect. Social landlords are required to understand and provide information and support that recognises the diverse needs of their tenants, including those arising from protected characteristics and language barriers. And the government will lay regulations as soon as possible this year on social housing provider funding made available this year for residential PEEPs. We will direct the regulator to set standards on competency and conduct of staff to ensure that tenants are treated with respect. At the national level, we have extended the social housing residents panel, which will help ensure that tenants' voices and experiences inform policy development. We will keep a new regulatory system under review. We will evaluate its effectiveness by 2028 to ensure it's delivering the improvements we needed. And also, we will set out further measures to strengthen residents' voices in the long-term housing strategy later this year.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Liberal Democrats stand firmly with the many bereaved and their family members, as well as the immediate community, friends, neighbours, as they mourn the 72, including children who tragically lost their lives in 2017. Any steps regarding the changes to the building will be a deeply personal matter for that community, Madam Deputy Speaker. And any decisions regarding the future of the building, I know the Secretary of State will approach with due respect for the local community, survivors and victims. We welcome, therefore, the Government's decision to work with the Grenfell Memorial Commission to design a memorial and urge the Government to approach the discussions, as I'm sure she will, the Secretary of State will, with respect and sympathy to those who suffered. Liberal Democrats are also concerned that as we approach 8 years on from Grenfell, there are still thousands of people in the UK living in buildings with dangerous cladding. The Grenfell inquiry provided a detailed look at the facts leading up to the night of the 14th of June 2017, including underlying causes of the fire, where mistakes were made, the condition of the tower, the response to the public and emergency services. And with regard to the recommendations to the architectural profession, I refer the House to my register of interests as a member of the Royal Institute. There are lessons, though, to be learned for every authority in the land. And we recognise the previous government provided funding to start this process, which is now slowly being allocated to deal with cladding, but now it's time to accelerate that vital work to make all buildings safe. We're concerned that too many developers and building owners are passing the costs of remediation work onto tenants and leaseholders, which puts many at serious financial risk. Liberal Democrats endorse all 57 recommendations of the Grenfell Phase 2 report from Sir Martin Morbick, which includes pointing to creating a legally enforceable order to remediate premises so they are safe on pain of criminal sanction. But we need to take further steps to guard against commercial interests overriding safety, as they did both in the testing of materials and in the enforcement of building regulations. And we would like to see more done to ensure that commerciality will not shockingly and disgracefully once again override interests of safety. It is time to invest in our housing stock so that the cladding is dealt with. It is time for justice for the victims and all those living in unsafe housing. Lib Dems stand ready to work across party to do so.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for his commitment and his support in taking forward the recommendations that came from the inquiry, and also can I also thank him for his comments in regards to ensuring that we take decisions about the future of Grenfell in the most sensitive of ways, and I absolutely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and I'm committed to taking the next steps respectfully and carefully with the community. I'm also continue to support the independent Grenfell Tower Memorial Commission as the community choose a design team to work with them on designing a memorial. Can I also agree with him that the priority is that we have to work at pace as quick as we possibly can, Madam Deputy Speaker, because this work is urgent and we're working as quickly as possible. Some of the inquiry recommendations are wide-reaching and some will require further work, including public consultation before they can be delivered. But where we can work quickly, like the machinery of government change, moving fire to my department as an example, we're committed to do that as well. Hopefully the Honourable Gentleman has heard my words on the acceleration of remediation, our action plan there, and also I agree entirely with his comments, and hopefully that was respected in my response earlier around commerciality not taking precedent or having any control over safety. Safety must come first, and this government is committed to that.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement today and the Prime Minister for his statement on September 4th that made clear that the lessons from Grenfell are central to this government's mission. Today is another painful step towards truth, justice and change for the bereaved families of the 72 people who lost their lives at Grenfell, the survivors and the community in my constituency of Kensington and Bayswater, many of which who have joined us here today, and I pay tribute again to their strength and resilience. The fight for justice, now nearly 8 years long, will continue after today and every day until we have criminal prosecutions and true accountability for those responsible, including those companies referenced in the inquiry report. I know the government has looked seriously at the inquiry recommendations, and I welcome the commitment to meaningful change across all of them. But it does remain the case that recommendations from public inquiries too often fail to be implemented. Indeed, if the lessons from previous fires had been learned, including Lakanal House in 2009, then lives would have been saved. This was avoidable. So can the Deputy Prime Minister assure me that the government will consider a strong mechanism of oversight to ensure accountability for implementing what has been set out today, so it lasts beyond any one government and leads to real change? And will she also provide further detail on how she plans to ensure accountability for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, given their culpability before, during and after the fire, and the desperately needed change in their culture and the improvement in the quality of services today in our community?
Can I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to the way in which he has constructively challenged and worked with us on behalf of his constituents. I know this report has been great personal significance for his constituents, and I pay tribute to his dedicated work as an advocate in calling for truth, justice and change for the Grenfell community. And I agree that robust oversight of government's implementation of the response is essential for this and all public inquiries. The system needs to be improved, and we are taking forward inquiries recommendations on oversight. We will create a publicly accessible record on Gov.uk of recommendations made by public inquiries since 2024, and we will consider making this a legal requirement as part of a wider review of the inquiries framework. For the Grenfell inquiry recommendations, my department will publish quarterly progress updates on gov.uk until they have all been delivered, and we will report annually to Parliament to enable members to scrutinise our progress and hold us to account. In terms of my honourable friend's comments in regard to the Council failed in some of its most fundamental duties, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep residents safe, to listen to their concerns and respond effectively when disaster struck. They were right to apologise, but it's clear more must be done. I've welcomed the Council's commitment to improvement and culture change, and I've set my challenge to the leader of the Council to ensure that these improvements are a reality felt by the Council's residents, and I will continue to engage and keep an eye on that progress.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today, and indeed all of our thoughts are, of course, with the victims and the families of the victims. And I know she will keep us up to date with what is going to happen in terms of a permanent memorial. The key issue here, the big failure that she hasn't spoken about, was of course the testing regime for the products that were put on Grenfell and buildings up and down this country. And the signing off of those testing regimes where firms deliberately cheated on the system, and indeed they were still signed off as being safe. So will she undertake to ensure that the safety mechanisms and testing of products in systems is actually undertaken so that we can ensure that the buildings for the future and the buildings we've got already will be made safe and safe for the residents that live in them?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and I absolutely agree with what he says. The government is committed to a system-wide reform of the construction products regime, ensuring that we address the significant gaps that the Grenfell inquiry and the independent review of construction product testing have exposed. The construction products green paper that we have published today is a significant step forward towards a construction products regime that has public safety at its heart, and I hope we can continue to work cross-government and across this House to make sure that we have a system that is fit for purpose for the future.
Leaseholder.
Thank you much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Secretary of State go a little further than she did to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington and Bayswater? It's good that she's going to have a publicly accessible record of recommendations. Will she commit to what the Charity Inquest and many others have asked for, which is a national oversight mechanism, i.e. a body which collates, analyses and follows up on the recommendations of inquiries and inquests, because otherwise there is a real danger that these recommendations and others will gather dust on the shelf.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I heard directly from members of the Grenfell community their call for the government to introduce a national oversight mechanism. We recognise this goes wider than Grenfell, and it is an important issue for other communities and families as well, that such as those that were affected by COVID-19 and the blood scandal. We're considering this in the year ahead as part of the measures to strengthen public inquiries, and the government will listen to the views of the affected families as part of this consideration.
Julie Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the Grenfell tragedy was an appalling one, but it also threw a blanket of uncertainty over countless residents in many of our constituencies who are trapped in cladded properties. So when I hear the Deputy Prime Minister talk about a new regulatory regime and change, I confess I feel very nervous that any changes to the regulatory regime will throw further uncertainty over those who are still trapped in their homes. So can she provide assurances to the House that any move she makes will not create further uncertainty about the standards to which buildings need to be remediated? And then can I also highlight to her the case of my constituents in Harrow Wood who had their buildings assessed by a fire risk assessor who was subsequently struck off. Those people that thought they were going to be released from this terrible stasis are now back to not knowing where they stand. So can she please also look into these concerns?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope that what we're announcing today and what we're trying to do is around bringing clarity to the system. I think one of the things that came out of the Phase 2 report was where the system was disjointed, and actually bringing clarity will hopefully make sure that people understand what they are meant to do, what their legal obligations are, that we expect them to do it, and if they don't do it, there will be serious consequences for those that don't. I also point to the remediation acceleration plan. I completely understand that many people still are in buildings that are unsafe, and that is unacceptable, and that's why this government is taking action on that. And in terms of the Horingwood case that she mentioned, I'm happy for her to meet with the Building Safety Minister.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the Secretary of State for her important statement today. The people of Grenfell were treated badly because of who they were and what they looked like and how much they earned. We say 72 people were killed in Grenfell. The police are holding ashes to which they have no name. And nobody should have to go through this. The family should never have to go through this. This should never happen again. So will the Secretary of State agree with me that, as well as the CEOs of the companies, all of the people in the council who treated the residents badly and did not listen to them because of what they looked like, everybody needs to be held accountable?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. And at the heart of the new regulatory regime is the requirement that all landlords treat their tenants with fairness and respect and take action as that the services they provide are fair and equitable outcomes. Social landlords are required to understand and provide information and support that recognises the diverse needs of their tenants, including those arising from protected characteristics. This hasn't been so in the past, Madam Deputy Speaker, and if I'm honest, it doesn't feel, when I speak to the residents of the community, that it is that today, and that's why I've pushed the council in that particular area, and that's why this government is bringing forward legislation that says we respect people, whether they're social tenants or whether they're private tenants. They deserve a safe and secure home and be treated with dignity and respect.
Tim Farron.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement and indeed the moves generally towards centralised regulation and improved safety. Doesn't the report just serve as a single act of shame for this country. As she has just alluded to, it reveals that it has been considered that the safety and the quality of social housing matters less, because the people who live in social housing matter less. Shouldn't there be a matter of deep national repentance of that point of view, which has been the case really since the decline in standards of building since the 1960s? So as she seeks to tackle this, has she spoken to, and is she continue to speak to, her right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer? Because there is a cost involved in making sure that we build to a high standard, as we did in the immediate post-war period, whilst also expanding the number of social rented homes, particularly in parts of the country where build costs are more expensive, like London and like the Lake District.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for the way in which he articulates something that I am still dismayed to this day, that archaic attitudes toward people in social tenancy is considered in that way. I was a social tenant for a very long time and grew up in a council house, and the way in which these people were treated, especially after this report. I ask anyone who works in social housing, Madam Deputy Speaker, to read the report, at least read the executive findings if they don't want to go through the chapters that I went through. The horrifying way that people were treated that Sir Martin outlines in his report, and that is a shame for our country, and we must do better, and hopefully the legislation we're bringing forward will bring about a cultural change. And I absolutely agree with him that social housing should be of high quality and safe. It should be affordable, it should be warm, and that's why this government will continue to do that. Safety will not be compromised in building 1.5 million homes, and nor will the 1.5 million homes compromise us on bringing homes that are currently not at standard up to standard, because we've all seen the reports, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've all seen on the television the programmes where people are still living in damp and mouldy properties. That has to end.
Yeah. Ben Coleman.
Speaker, I also very much welcome the statement by the Deputy Prime Minister. The people who lived in Grenfell Tower and the people in my constituency in Chelsea and Fulham who stands shoulder to shoulder with them. The people have suffered hugely and the pain is still felt throughout the whole community. And I'm delighted to hear my honourable friend, the member for Kensington Bayswater, highlighting again the culpability of the local council and of the contractors, and there is much for the council to do, I know from my own experience, to improve the way that it respects and deals with people living in social housing. I'd also like, if I may, to pick up on the point made very powerfully by my honourable friend from Vauxhall and Camberwell about disabled people, 15 of whom died in the Grenfell Tower because they had no personal emergency evacuation plan. And I welcome, as my honourable friend did, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's commitment to introduce regulation to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable people. But may I ask her, when will we see the details? Will this apply to all disabled residents wherever they live? What legal weight are these regulations going to have so that we can be absolutely sure that all is being done to ensure that we do not get a situation where disabled people do not have the evacuation plans they need to escape in the event of a terrible fire such as Grenfell?
I thank my honourable friend for those comments, and he's absolutely right. And since taking office, we have ensured that all of the outstanding Phase 1 recommendations were fully considered and responded to. The government announced on the 2nd of September 2024 that a residential peaks policy would be taken forward. We also committed funding for it, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the government will lay regulations as soon as possible with social housing providers funding made available this year. This policy aims to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled, vulnerable residents in high-rise and higher-rise residential buildings in England by providing residents with disability and impairments with a person-centred risk assessment to identify appropriate equipment and adjustments, to aid their fire safety evacuation, a residential PEEP statement that records what vulnerable residents should do in the event of a fire, and information for fire and rescue services in case they need to undertake evacuation. And we'll continue to keep this under review.
Sir Julian Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I return the House to my declaration of voluntary interests. Can I commend the Deputy Prime Minister for the sensitivity that she is and the way she's approaching this, both with families and in the House today. As she knows, mediation efforts being led by Lord Neuberger and others with residents of Grenfell, I genuinely believe mediation in this situation is of massive value. I realise much of this is in the legal sphere, but would she commit in any way she can and the government can to supporting these mediation efforts?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I think it's absolutely right that we look at all options, and I'm happy for him to take that up with our Safety Minister as well. But we want to continue to support the community. The community have been through so much. I visited that site, Madam Deputy Speaker. I saw the head teachers of the school where children who were not even born when the tragedy happened are still having the effects of the trauma today. So we're committed to supporting the community, the bereaved and the survivors as long as it takes.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her response to the report on Grenfell and the tragedy. Madam Deputy Speaker, flats in a large leasehold block in my constituency were given a B2 EWS1 certificate by Adam Kisiak of Trifire Limited. He and Trifire have now been investigated for potential malpractice by the Institute of Fire Engineers. One of my constituents, a leaseholder in the block, told me that they don't know if their certificates are valid. They don't know whether they'll be able to be remediated through the Building Safety Fund, and they don't even know whether their block actually does still have a safety issue, quite apart from the fact that those needing to move can't sell because mortgage lenders won't lend. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, how and when can leaseholders like my constituents get the assurance they need and that there will be no more fire inspectors being allowed to get away with what Adam Kisiak did?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that very important question, and I'm sorry for the situation that her constituents found themselves in. I understand the relevant professional body is investigating the case that is mentioned, and it would be wrong of me to comment on the specifics, but we are working to encourage mortgage lenders to act proportionately to support leaseholders and buyers in buildings with EWS ones that mortgage lenders are not accepting, and where buildings in a remediation scheme or the leaseholder is protected by the Building Safety Act, we expect the 10 lenders who have signed the industry cladding statement to honour it and not require the EWS one. And if the member wants to speak to the Safety Minister on this particular case going forward, I'm sure he'd be happy to speak to her.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement today, and particularly welcome the Government's acceptance of the recommendation to professionalise and regulate fire engineers and assessors, not least because at the committee stage of the Fire Safety Bill, I tabled new Clause 2, which would have created a public register of fire risk assessors, and it would have done so 5 years ago. Had my amendment been accepted, we may have been able to avoid what is now the developing scandal of the issuance of potentially fraudulent EWS1 certificates by Trifire, which could now have a devastating impact on thousands of leaseholders, including some in my constituency of St Albans. In light of concerns both in the media and concerns that have been raised in this House today by members of all sides, could I please urge the Deputy Prime Minister to both convene a meeting for all MPs whose constituents are affected, and would she agree with me that it is now time that the police investigate these reports?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will expand that invitation. I'm sure the Safety Minister will be happy to do that. And we will legislate to make it a mandatory requirement for fire risk assessors that are competent to perform their critical roles, certified against approved standards by a UKS accredited certification body. And the Government is supporting an industry-led British standard for fire risk assessors that's currently being drafted. And once this is completed, this will create a single clear definition of competence against which certification and qualification should be mapped.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our thoughts today are obviously with the Grenfell survivors and the family and friends of those who died. Can I thank my right honourable friend for a comprehensive response to the inquiry report. I think I agree with everything she said, but I want one point of clarification and one of pushing her to go a little bit further, if I could. First of all, on clarification, she's rightly said it's really important that we respect and value social housing tenants and treat them equally. Is she therefore going to give equal access to social housing tenants to the Building Safety Fund that is currently enjoyed by private leaseholders? And secondly, in terms of product testing, The testing of products by the construction manufacturers has been a disgrace over many years. They've gone round from one testing house to another till they've found one that actually passes the products. They could have several failures and one pass, but those products are on the market. Will she pick up a recommendation from the Select Committee in the last Parliament, cross-party, which said that every test done on a construction product should be made public, whether it's a failure or a pass, and then we can all see absolutely the real strength of these products and whether they really are fit for purpose before they're put on buildings.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and I'm certainly happy to look at that. We accepted all of the recommendations in full regarding what the Phase 2 report came out with, and I think it's an important baseline, but happy to look at what more we can do. And in terms of social housing as well, at the autumn budget we'll set out plans to give councils and housing associations the rent stability they need to be able to borrow and invest in both new and existing homes, while also ensuring that there's appropriate protections for both existing and future housing tenants. We'll bring forward details for future government investment as part of the forthcoming spending review, and we'll keep that under review.
Sir Julian Lewis. Leaseholders listening to the Deputy Prime Minister's very comprehensive statement today will have heard her mention the role of developers in remediation for those blocks covered in inadequate and dangerous cladding. Can she explain in more detail what happens where those developers may have defaulted in some way, may no longer be in existence, and freeholders then seek to visit the costs of remediation on the innocent leaseholders? I think the legislation covers this to some extent, but it would be helpful if she would set it out in more detail.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and they will get access to the cladding remediation scheme. And we're really clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that building owners must fix their buildings, and there's no doubt about that. And there are already legal powers to enforce landlords to act, and we'll make them do that quicker and give them a harder bite as part of that. But we also recognise that there is some elements where that won't happen, and that's why that scheme is available.
Oh, Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is right to say that progress has been made on building safety, but that we need to go much further. She'll know that fire and rescue services have already made huge improvements in this area, both with new equipment and also processes, but we must roll out stronger national standards across the fire and rescue sector. So can I ask her what progress has been made on establishing the National College of Fire and Rescue?
I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and he's absolutely right, and the Phase 2 report by Sir Martin was very clear on the recommendations, and we are taking them forward. We intend to launch a consultation on the College of Fire and Rescue, including proposed functions and structures this summer. Delivering a college will require careful planning and investment, as well as legislation to ensure that it would have the necessary legal foundations. And we're also considering funding models as part of the spending review.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome everything that the Deputy Prime Minister has said, and other honourable members too. But there is still a fatal flaw which has not been raised, and as someone with 30 years' experience in the real estate sector, can I urge the Deputy Prime Minister and her officials to focus on the single staircase? Because the 2009 Lacanau House report recommended that above 6 stories, retrospectively, fire suppression systems, sprinkler systems were installed. It's the best way to save lives. And I think we need to relook at that for existing buildings, and also future buildings can still be designed with a single staircase above 6 stories until 2028. That, Deputy Prime Minister, I would urge you to say is too long.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his contribution to this debate and also his expertise in this area. The approved document B is now subject to continuous review by the Building Safety Regulator, who has already taken steps in regards to this matter, and a wider review of building safety regulations will be undertaken, and we'll consider what action is needed from all resulting recommendations.
Mike Reader.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State and her team for their work on the Government's response to the inquiry. I would just say to the House, as someone who's spent my life in the construction sector, fixing construction products is incredibly challenging. So I really welcome the Green Paper published today because we have to get that right. Two questions to the Secretary of State. Could you confirm that the new regulator and advisor will work with existing government and industry bodies, including the Construction Leadership Council, which is co-chaired by the Minister of Industry and Mark Reynolds-Mace, who've done some brilliant work on building safety already? And could you also set out a bit more clearly the teeth that the new regulator is going to have to tackle dodgy developers and cowboy builders, big and small?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and yes, they will work together, and hopefully that's what we want to see. And the Building Safety Regulator, we've granted funding and also support for them and the Safety Executive to improve the support that's offered, and will continue to do so. They will have teeth. We will be looking at what further legislation we may need, Madam Deputy Speaker, but we expect where there is issues and where things have been highlighted that action is taken, and where action isn't taken, we expect there to be consequences.
Paula Denyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her commitment to the inquiry's recommendations and her commitment to systemic change. Picking up the thread from the two honourable members opposite around an oversight mechanism for state-related deaths, I was shocked when I discovered that it is nobody's job to track and make sure that recommendations from Prevention of Future Death reports are enacted. These have a relevance for victims of huge tragedies like this one, but just as much for individual tragedies such as that of one of my constituents. And so I have a private member's bill in on this proposal. So I would like to ask the Deputy Prime Minister to meet with me to talk about this idea in detail and how it can be enacted.
Well, again, I think the honourable member is absolutely right to raise this regarding oversight mechanism, and I think I've addressed some of that and the wider issues that, not just in terms of this inquiry, but all inquiries that we've had, and there's been far too many inquiries into tragedies in that we shouldn't be having these scandals and these tragedies happen in the first place. But we are committed to looking at what oversight mechanisms. I've detailed the oversight mechanisms that I expect from my department and the recommendations from Grenfell, and I'm happy for her to bring that information, share that with my department, and I'll take her considerations into account.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My thoughts today are with the survivors of the Grenfell Tower disaster and the 72 families who are mourning the loss of a loved one still, and I pay tribute to their immense dignity as they continue to fight for justice. I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's clear commitment to implement all of Sir Martin Morbick's recommendations. I have constituents in Dulwich and West Norwood living in blocks with fire safety issues, often not cladding related, but issues that have been identified as part of the wider scandal in the construction industry that was uncovered by fire safety inspections post-Grenfell. That in some cases there have been fires in these blocks, terrifying fires, leaving residents feeling unsafe and leaving leaseholders trapped in unsellable flats as building owners and construction firms argue over who is responsible for the fire safety defects and fail to move forward to resolve the issues. So can the Deputy Prime Minister say, as she moves forward to implement Sir Martin's recommendations, when she would expect my constituents to have a clear plan with a timescale attached to it for the remediation work that is needed in unsafe buildings, and where is the accountability in the meantime?
Again, I thank my honourable friend for her comments, and I absolutely agree that, you know, nearly 8 years on from the tragedy of Grenfell, people are still living in unsafe buildings, and that's completely unacceptable. I did respect and pay tribute to the previous governments, what they've done, and those legislation has enabled authorities to take action, and we've been supporting them in making sure that action is taken from those bodies, and our remediation acceleration plan will also outline how we can ensure that those responsible for remediating buildings, whether that's fire safety or any other defects, are held accountable, and that we can take those actions and get that remediation done as quickly as possible. I do not want it to take another 8 years before people are living in safe and secure homes. I expect to do it as quickly as possible, and action is already being taken.
Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. And can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for what she said today and how she said it. I hope that the families of the survivors of Grenfell Tower have heard what you have to say and find some reassurance in the acceptance of all of the recommendations. I have residents in my constituency of Surrey Heath who are today trapped in just the latest chapter of the fire safety scandal. Residents who have EWS1 forms similarly signed off by the notorious now fire safety engineer Adam Kiziak, who find themselves unable to sell their properties, unable to remortgage, but even more fundamentally, who don't know whether they are living in a dangerous building or not, and in neighbouring buildings built at exactly the same time, but signed off or have had their EWS1 forms produced by a different fire safety engineer, they have already been stripped of their cladding. I'm incredibly grateful to hear that you have accepted recommendations 15 and 16 and that you are looking at a professionalisation of the fire safety industry, greater regulation and a commitment to greater recruitment, because we know that those are some of the issues that have underpinned the EWS1 scandal. But can I urge you and your team, please, to think about emergency measures. And it can't just be right that we overlook the EWS1 forms that people already have because people don't know whether they are living in safe buildings or not. It cannot be right that we just overlook those forms. Yeah. We have to fundamentally, rapidly reassess the safety of those buildings in order to allow them to be sellable or remediated again. Thank you.
Well, again, I refer back to what I said to my honourable friend, and I absolutely accept that people should be in safe and secure homes. The government remediation funds have a robust audit process in place to assess the quality of the fire risk assessments of external wards, and the audit process ensures that assessments that are carried out for buildings that are in our remediation funding programmes meet the appropriate standards, and where these standards are not met, we will take action to ensure that this is addressed.
Yeah.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The report on the Grenfell Tower inquiry is utterly scathing about the role of central government and its obsession with deregulation. The drive to scrap the so-called red tape was a key failing which led to such a terrible incident and avoidable loss of life. So can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm to the House that this approach has been ditched in relation to policies which are concerning fire safety, building safety and the construction sector?
Again, my honourable friend's absolutely right to highlight that just about every system failed, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I outlined in my opening statement. Everybody needs to understand what led to what happened on that night in Grenfell, and that there has been action taken. There isn't the same regulatory system that was in place back in 2017. There has been a number of Acts of Parliament that has meant that there is more instruction and more legal requirements for building safety. We will continue to update that. We have legislation going through at the moment in Parliament which hopefully will deal with social landlords and will give renters more protection as well. We know there's much more for us to do, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope across the House we'll continue to work to put safety at the heart of everything we do, because that will be the legacy of Grenfell, is that we take notice. We don't just say warm words at this dispatch box, but we actually take the action that's needed to protect people.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for bringing the report forward, and also thank the Government for accepting all of the recommendations, and also echo the points from around the Chamber that our thoughts today are with the survivors and the families of the victims. As is often said, justice delayed is justice denied. So can the Deputy Prime Minister please give a timeline for when the companies, as mentioned, Arconic, Kingspan, Saint-Gobain or Celotex, but also the testing firms who covered up these failed results, when will they face justice for their dishonesty and mis-selling that so tragically contributed to the deaths of 72 innocent residents?
Yeah. Again, I echo what the Honourable Gentleman said in terms of where our thoughts and sentiments are today as we all are in this chamber. I spoke about the justice and justice being delayed, and I think it's awful that people still haven't got the justice and fearful that they'll never receive the justice. The police have said that this will take time. This is one of the largest and most legally complex investigations ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police, with over 180 officers and staff dedicated to the investigation, and we will continue to support them in their important work. The police have recently confirmed that they have everything they need to do that, and will continue to support their efforts. And I said in my opening statement around procurement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and making sure that we can do something in regards to construction products, and my honourable friend sat on the front bench is taking that forward.
John Grady.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my constituency, tenants in social housing are regularly treated as second-class citizens. And it is a shame and a stain on our society that this is so. And in my constituency, many people are desperately worried about cladding remediation following the terror of Grenfell. The Scottish Government received about £97 million from the government for cladding remediation, and confirmed later on last year that virtually none of this had been spent on cladding remediation. And I wrote to the Scottish Minister responsible this year with a detailed set of questions about progress about cladding remediation. How many high-rise buildings, that's over 80, with ACM cladding had been identified? How many of them had been identified as requiring remediation? How many of such high-rise buildings had been remediated? These are people's homes, Madam Deputy Speaker. And my questions carried on. And not one of those questions were answered with data or numbers. These are people's homes. They are mums and dads, children. Will the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that the Scottish Government must get a grip on this topic, and would she undertake to me that she would provide such advice and assistance in that regard as her department could provide? I'm obliged, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you to my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right that it is a devolved matter, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the Scottish Government, but I'm happy to work with the Scottish Government. I hope they've looked at what we're doing in regards to the remediation acceleration plan, and also the reforms that are underway which will drive up standards in social housing through stronger regulation and enforcement measures by strengthening tenants' voice and improving tenants' access to redress. He's absolutely right to raise these issues. I hope the Scottish Government are following in our footsteps and will continue to learn the legacy of what happened in Grenfell, so that people in Scotland and England can feel safe.
Sean Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Deputy Prime Minister particularly for the comments she made about the way that residents were treated. I want to raise the strong recommendation that the Civil Contingencies Act is looked at, because my former role involved listening to and trying to support the many local community organisations who were dealing with the enormous gaps in the humanitarian response that was left by the local authority, and these problems carried on for weeks. So could the Deputy Prime Minister tell us when we will hear the timing and the format of that review of the Civil Contingencies Act?
Well, again, we looked at the Civil Contingency Act and also the Category 1 training, and we've said that we accept and we will take them forward. We want to do it as quickly as possible, and we'll be working with local partners to scope progress for local authorities on training, and working with all other departments to make sure we can do that as quickly as possible. And I also commend her for her comments in regard to social housing tenants. I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, listening to members from all across this House today that represent their constituents, that those outside of the House are listening.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement today and her continued commitment to get justice for the victims of this terrible tragedy. I had the opportunity to meet some of the families of those victims, and I want to commend their bravery. I will also, of course, take this opportunity to pay tribute to my constituent, Rod Wainwright, who was one of the first responders on that terrible morning. Does the Secretary of State agree with me we need to do more to support our emergency services like Rod and his colleagues, who were also the victims of this terrible tragedy? And let me join with my honourable friend from Bent East from praying and hoping that we never have to see something like this again.
Secretary of State.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I pay tribute to Rob and his colleagues. And of course, not long after being appointed into this position as Secretary of State, of course, there's another fire within Barking and Dagenham, and it was the same first responders that were out again, and the trauma and the fact that they put themselves at arm's way without question or fear is an absolute testament for the work that they do, and we owe them a debt of gratitude, and we also owe them the support ongoing when they have done that, and we continue as a government to do that.
Final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank very much the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement today and for the update in relation to Phase 2 of the inquiry report. I think we all in this House would be encouraged by the Honourable Lady's commitment to find two things: make sure that those who carry it out are held responsible under the law of the land. Number two, to ensure that safety is improved, and that's what I would like to see. In December past, the government started plans to ban firms involved in the Grenfell fire from the public procurement. Whilst this is a very welcome step, Madam Deputy Speaker, what steps can be taken or will be taken to ensure that all firms involved in building works are liable, to ensure that all materials and products are fit for purpose, to ensure that lessons can be learnt for the future from this awful tragedy? And will the Deputy Prime Minister share the conclusions with all regional administrations, especially the Northern Ireland Assembly, so that safety across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be improved and that we all gain? Thank you so much.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and my honourable friend, the Minister, met in Northern Ireland yesterday, so I absolutely agree with him that we should all work together to improve safety, and also that we need to make sure that the building safety regulator and what we put in train actually produces the results that we need. Hopefully, Madam Deputy Speaker, this will be a clearer path. It will be clear about what people's legal obligations are, where they sit, and if they don't do what they are expected to do, that they will be absolute enforcement of those rules.
That concludes that statement. I'll give the ministers and the front bench some time just to readjust. I'll have the 10-minute rule motion, and I call Sarah Coombs.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for a review of certain offences relating to vehicle registration marks and for connected purposes, and I thank the Minister for Roads for being here at this debate today. When I got elected, I didn't expect to be a road safety campaigner, but since I became MP for West Bromwich, family after family have come to me having lost a husband, or a mother, or a son through other people's dangerous driving. Our roads are used by millions of people every day. They are vital to our communities, our economy, and to keep us connected. And most people drive safely and are just trying to take their kids to school, get to work, or do the weekly shop. But there are some selfish people who use our roads as racetracks, who care nothing about risking other people's lives, and who are evading capture using dodgy ghost number plates. It's one of the central missions of our Labour government to take back our streets and restore a sense of safety in our communities. We've invested millions to fill in potholes to reduce danger, and I hope we can now take action on something that's making our roads unsafe for all. The issue of so-called ghost plates was first brought to my attention when I was standing on Kenrick Way, a busy A road in my constituency, with our local Police and Crime Commissioner and the Secretary of State for Transport. We were talking about the nightmare car races that cause hell for local residents on Friday and Saturday nights, when as many as 50 cars converge on the area to race up and down this long, straight road. The Police and Crime Commissioner, Simon Foster, and local roads policing experts explained that it was increasingly hard to catch these dangerous drivers due to the rise in ghost plates, or stealth plates. That was the first time I had ever heard of ghost plates, and I believe that today is the first time they've ever been raised in this House. There has been little mainstream media coverage about ghost plates up till now, but go on TikTok or on Instagram and I can tell you they are widely known. And I'd like to thank Camera Commissioners Tony Porter and Fraser Sampson, Rob Gurney and Stuart Barnes as well, and Chief Inspector Keely Bevington and West Midlands Police for their advice and their hard work over the years bringing this issue to light. So what is a ghost or a stealth plate? These ghost plates look like normal number plates to the human eye, but they've got a reflective coating on them, or they've been interfered with in some way, which makes them unreadable to the infrared police speed cameras on our roads. If you Google ghost plates, you'll be presented with websites where you can buy a ghost plate online for as little as £30, making the vehicle invisible to the automatic number plate recognition cameras that police use to stop speeding and keep our roads safe. These websites selling ghost plates are full of disclaimers, reassuring you that they're perfectly legal as long as you don't use them on the roads. But the fact is, these plates are being used on our roads by people who want to speed around freely, run red lights, and much, much worse. And right now, if you've got a ghost plate and you speed past a camera at 100 miles an hour, the likelihood is you won't be caught. It is illegal to use these plates, but the current consequences of being caught with one are far too small. At the moment, the penalty for driving with a ghost plate is just a £100 fine. No points, no driving ban, just £100, and that is if you're caught. That's less than you get for a speeding ticket. So for those who want to drive recklessly around our roads or commit even worse crimes, why wouldn't you when the penalty is so small? The scale of use of ghost plates is not yet widely known, although we do know there are major issues with clone plates and wider forms of dodgy plates. One study found that as many as 1 in 15 drivers may already be using anti-ANPR technology. However, among some groups, it could be even higher. One police exercise conducted in London examined more than 1,000 taxi and private hire vehicles and found 40% of those vehicles had ghost plates. Wolverhampton Council, my honourable friend is here from Wolverhampton now, is one of the local authorities taking a lead on this issue, and they are working with police to use new types of cameras to find and punish the drivers that are using these ghost plates. Rochdale Trading Standards have also been pioneers in combating these plates. These organisations have done great work, but this is truly a national problem. What I worry about is that the supply of these ghost plates is making all of our roads less safe. In the West Midlands, 1,000 people are killed or seriously injured on our roads each year. Across the UK, that is 30,000 people. I've been working with the charity Road Peace, who helped my constituents when they suffered terrible losses, like Diane, whose husband was killed by a driver on her phone, and a family in Oldbury who lost their mother and their grandmother, who was hit by a car that sped away. A couple of weeks ago, the RAC found that almost half of UK police forces have caught motorists driving more than 90 miles an hour on 30-mile-an-hour roads. West Midlands Police clocked a driver going at 100 on a 30-mile-an-hour road. If a driver is using a ghost plate, then most current police cameras will struggle to identify the car and catch and punish the driver. However, police and local authorities are getting wise to these plates and investing in new technology to catch them. But right now, it's too easy to buy one of these ghost plates, and the consequences for having one are far too soft. And there's no consequences for the companies who sell these online with these disclaimers about not being able to use them on the roads when they know full well that is exactly what they're being used for. This bill calls for a review of the penalties for ghost plates, and I think we need to see fines of £1,000 as well as 6 points on your licence. The current fine of £100 is hardly a deterrent, but a £1,000 fine, the threat of 6 penalty points, potentially even vehicle seizure or licence disqualification, those would be ways to clamp down on the use and supply of ghost plates. This would not only make our roads safer, but ensure our roads cannot be used to carry out crime. This also speaks to something wider, about the immense importance of a little piece of plastic that is the number plate. This little piece of plastic upholds the rules of our roads, from traffic laws and speeding fines to car insurance, road tax and bus lanes. It also enables the police to track and arrest criminals who are using cars to flee the scenes of crime and move drugs and stolen goods. And yet, this little piece of plastic is removable, modifiable, clonable, and almost entirely unregulated. The humble number plate, as Camera Commissioner Tony Porter called it, is under threat, because the national camera system that is used to keep all our roads safe, ANPR, is being undermined by people who are using dodgy and ghost plates. Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, it should be a basic right for all of us to feel safe as we walk, cycle and drive along our streets. But the reality is, too many of us don't. That's why the new government has committed to publishing a road safety strategy, the first in over a decade, which is something I really welcome. The majority of drivers in West Brom and around the whole country just want to get from A to B safely. But there are a select minority of people who think that they are above the law and that by using a ghost plate, they can get away with running red lights, drink driving, speeding, and much, much worse. It cannot be right that these drivers are not facing the consequences of their actions and are creating so much danger for everyone else. So I urge the government to consider this bill in their road safety strategy. The drivers using these ghost plates have gone under the radar for too long, but now they've been rumbled and it's time to crack down on them.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of their opinions say aye? Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Chris Blore, Antonia Bantz, Serena Brackenridge, Sonia Kumar, Sean Davis, Gurinder Josan, Jacob Collier, Sarah Edwards, Paul Waugh, Rachel Taylor, Lee Ingham and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sarah Coombs. Keep it straight now.
Thank you. Vehicle Registration Offences Review Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 7th of March.
Friday, the 7th of March. Now, motion number 2 on business of the House. Minister to move.
Move formally.
The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The 7 o'clock motion. Minister to move formally.
Formally.
We don't actually need it, but thank you very much for that. Forgive me. No, it was myself. Thank you. We're all very keen to crack on. We're now going on to the debate for this afternoon. We'll just let the front benches quickly shuffle over. We have hours to continue to be excited, folks. Hours. We now come to the motion. In the name of the Leader of the Opposition on family businesses. The Speaker has not selected the amendments, and I call Mal Stride to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motion on the order paper. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last general election, the party opposite, now the government, told us that they aspired to become the natural party of business. The natural party of business. An absurd suggestion, given what has happened over the last 7 short months. As absurd, perhaps, as the business secretary claiming to be a qualified lawyer. Or as absurd, perhaps, as the Attorney General claiming to be a patriotic lawyer. Or absurd, perhaps, as the Prime Minister claiming to be anything other than a lawyer. The economy, Madam Deputy Speaker, has tanked. Inflation recently spiked at 3%. It is to go still further higher. It was 2% on the day of the general election, a legacy that we bequeath to the party opposite. Borrowing is up, substantially up, on the forecasts the OBR produced at the last budget. And growth has been killed stone dead. Growth that the Bank of England tells us will grow, an economy that will grow at half the rate that it had originally suggested. It is no wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker, that all the business confidence surveys show confidence crashing through the floor as a result of what this government is doing. Businesses laying off jobs, businesses putting up prices, businesses reducing investment, businesses sometimes having to put themselves up for sale or even worse, going under. I will give way to the Honourable Lady. Right.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just on that specific point, a local businessman actually wrote to me and he said he'd spent over 50 years building his engineering business from the ground up. only to now face the possibility that his life's work could be dismantled due to the unfair tax burden. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? Why on earth would anybody want to start a business in the current climate that's been created by the benches opposite?
Well, lady is absolutely right, and we see it there in these surveys to which I refer. Business confidence at virtually an all-time low. And of course, before this whirlwind of disaster visited us, Madam Deputy Speaker, we had a calmer time during the general election. A Labour Party on best behaviour with business. A Labour Party with a manifesto that sought to reassure business. Indeed, explicitly ruled out the possibility of an increase in national insurance. A Labour Party that was on the prawn cocktail circuit, that was countenancing canapes and calm. The breathy seduction of the previous Shadow Chancellor. The Business Secretary hopping about in the background dispensing free legal advice to whoever cared to listen. With Labour, Madam Deputy Speaker, everything seemed possible. Business would be safe in their tender hands, but it wasn't. Trust was destroyed, the wrong decisions were taken. And why? Because the front bench opposite has not a jot of real-world business experience sitting there at all. In fact, around the Cabinet table, less than half of those present have had any experience in the private sector whatsoever. Far from being the natural party of business, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the most anti-business government in modern political history. Madam Deputy Speaker, the British Chamber of Commerce in its surveys shows that tax is now the #1 concern of businesses. The Federation of Small Businesses says that in the last quarter of last year, business confidence hit the lowest level ever recorded in their surveys, save for the pandemic. It is almost as if just about the only way that small businesses have been created today is due to the shrinkage of larger ones. Firms crushed by the wrong policies. Take national insurance. This measure has not even commenced, as we know. It comes in April, and yet it is already driving down employment. It is already driving up prices and inflation. It is a ticking tax time bomb waiting to go off in early April. It affects the lowest paid the hardest. Those on part-time work will bear the brunt of this measure. Those sectors that are labour intensive. Hospitality in a moment. Hospitality UK found that 750,000 more jobs will be subject to national insurance as a direct effect of this government's plans. And Young's the brewer, an extra 20 pence on the price of a pint. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Gentleman giving way, and I'm pleased that he's expressed concern for people who are on lower wages, and in that case I hope he will welcome from this dispatch box the decision of this Labour government to increase the living wage by 6.7% from April this year.
Centre of the party that increased the personal allowance and doubled it between 2010 and the present day, taking millions of people out of tax altogether, and the party that brought in the national living wage. We have done a great deal to support, particularly the lowest paid in our society. When it comes to... I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Chancellor. Isn't the point here, it's the culmination of all the changes the Labour government have been put in. This government has indeed raised national insurance and may need to do so in the future. But the key point is, it's all these ramifications, the living wage change, the cuts in the business rate relief, the red tape being put in with the Employment Rights Bill and the national insurance contributions all going up. It's that toxic concoction that's going to kill off growth that's a problem we have. Does he agree?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it is not as if, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government was not warned about these issues. The OBR in its reports makes it extremely clear that whilst, for example, 25 billion is the headline figure to be raised through the national insurance contribution changes, the actual net is far less than that because of the behavioural impacts that necessarily follow when you tax jobs. You don't need to have spent a decade, Madam Deputy Speaker, at the Bank of England to know that. National insurance increases lead to fewer jobs, lower wages, higher prices. And this government, of course, piling on the regulation with its Employment Rights Bill. And we know that that increases the risk of employing people at a time when the employment market itself is softening, I will in a moment, and putting an end to flexible working practices, which benefit many businesses, but also suit many of the people that benefit from them, particularly younger people and those who are more elderly. Given this, it is astonishing that this Chancellor has launched a tax raid on family businesses, and I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do thank the Shadow Chancellor for giving way. Could he spell out the specific rights in the Employment Rights Bill that he believes and his party believes should not be afforded to working people in this country?
For example, he asked a very fair question. To be put in a situation where employers will be fearful of taking on new hires because of the consequences that may follow, to have a situation where trade unions are going to be advantaged in the way that the bill suggests, the trade union paymasters that support perhaps the honourable gentleman, but certainly many of his colleagues, the minimum service standards legislation that we brought in, that this bill, as I understand it, will overturn. None of these things are going to be good for jobs. They're not going to be good for people searching for employment. They're not going to be good for businesses, and they're not going to be good for the UK economy. I'll give way one more time.
I'm happy to declare interest, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a member of many proud trade unions, and my declaration is up to date and free for all to see. And I very much enjoyed the Shadow Chancellor's answer to my question, but perhaps I could pose it again, taking a lesson from his own lead, and he might want to answer it this time. What are the specific rights in the Employment Rights Bill that he and his party oppose? It's in the motion to say the Employment Rights Bill should be stopped. So what are the rights in that bill that he opposes working people having?
Already answered, as he knows. Actually, to paraphrase the leader of his own party, I've already answered the honourable gentleman's questions. But I note his serial offence of being a member of several trade unions at the moment. But good of him to have disclosed that. Madam Deputy Speaker, the changes to business property relief are going to see the break-up of many family firms. Now, the government will say, of course, that it will only have an impact on the wealthiest estates because there is the £1 million threshold. But how many of those companies are going to have that cash or availability to that money to settle those particular liabilities? And the value, of course, within many businesses lies in their assets. And liquidating those assets to pay those kind of liabilities, given that those assets are often instrumental to the effective working of that firm, is an absurdity. And we also know that changes will damage businesses' ability to borrow against assets where there is a sword of Damocles hanging over their head by way of a potential future inheritance tax liability. Madam Deputy Speaker, research by CBI Economics for Family Business UK suggests that this policy may actually not even raise any money. Of those firms that are going to be impacted, the average company, those companies said that on average they would be investing 17% less in their business as a consequence of this measure. And in fact, 15% of those businesses that would be impacted said that they would sell their business altogether. The rules, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, are going to be complex. There will be plenty of red tape. There will be legal advice to be taken from solicitors, yes, real ones. There will be some people that will pay through dividends on which they will already have been taxed. So they will be taxed twice. Tax on tax, as we know, is the Labour Party way. And Madam Deputy Speaker, William Lees-Jones of J.W. Lees, the long-established family brewery and pub operator in the North West, has said that the family business tax would, quote, inevitably reduce future investment in the company. But he goes on to say something else that is important, and I quote, it would also place our business at a considerable disadvantage to our competitors who tend to be listed or owned by private equity, sometimes overseas. And so it is that British institutions, which in some cases have been in the same family for decades or indeed even centuries, may end up shutting down or being forced to sell to foreign buyers as a result of this single reckless policy. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. What Labour do not seem to understand is that every business starts with an idea, with a hope, with a dream. The individual then puts their whole heart, their soul, and every working hour they have into building their business, often as a whole family endeavour over many generations. It is that, not just the economics and the jobs, which Labour are destroying.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and this is why the dearth of experience of entrepreneurship on the benches opposite really shows. And we see this not just with BPR, but agricultural property relief as well, the family farm being broken up. Years and generations of people struggling, working hard, whatever the weather, to grow those businesses, to provide the food that we need, swept asunder by a stroke of the Treasury's pen. And I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful again for him giving way. The Prime Minister was interviewed and said that the reason for doing this to farmers was to be able to give them the NHS that they might need. Only a week later, the £10 million fund that was there to support the mental health of farmers has been taken away. How does that stick in the throat of the farmers when they're told they're not a priority, food security is not a priority, and actually now they won't have the health service there in place, despite the tax that they're now going to ensue?
The treatment, Madam Deputy Speaker, of our farmers by this government has been utterly atrocious. Right before the last general election, the Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, and now the Secretary of State for DEFRA, looked the NFU in the eye and told them that at least on the measure of inheritance tax, farmers had nothing to fear from a future Labour government. And yet the point that my honourable friend makes is absolutely telling. They cared nothing about any of them. Within a matter of months of coming into office, they had already brought in their agricultural property relief changes, to the detriment of thousands of hard-working farmers up and down our country. I give way to the honourable lady.
Thanks the right honourable member for giving way, and I'd like to ask him whether it was also the concern for the well-being of our farming communities and their mental health and the food security just discussed by members on those benches, whether that was also a concern of yours when the Conservative government over the 14 years also sold our farmers down the river with dodgy trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. Was that your concern then?
No, not at all.
Before the Shadow Chancellor responds, a concern of yours would mean the Chair. So let's start off today's business in good form. Shadow Chancellor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I should put on the record you have always been very pro-farmers, and it should not in any way should that ever be brought into question by anybody in this chamber. I am extremely proud of our record supporting farmers up and down the country, ever since I first came into this House, 2010, representing a highly rural constituency right in the middle of beautiful Devon. There are many schemes and much support and much money and financial support and so on that this government, when it was in office, should be very proud of. But we would, yes, who would like to get, give way to.
I thank him for giving way, and I thought I'd let him, make some progress in his speech. It seems odd to hear a speech from the Conservative Party about the economy without a mention of Liz Truss. And now, of course, we have trade deals mentioned on the benches opposite. So I'll ask him very directly, does he think that the policies of Liz Truss, but he can't hear because you're shouting, not you, madam, they are shouting.
Intervention should be very short. Come to a conclusion quickly.
I'll ask him, does he think the policies of Liz Truss were good for business investment and confidence in the economy?
Well, the honourable gentleman may or may not be aware that at the time of the mini-budget, I was the chair of the Treasury Select Committee. I had a lot to say about what was being proposed before it happened. I had a lot to say at the time that it happened, and I've had a lot to say since then, and all that is a matter for the public record. If the honourable lady wants to intervene, I'm very, very happy to do so. But, Madam, or on that point, go on.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been invited to make an intervention, so I'll just very quickly say that whilst the honourable gentleman was reasonably outspoken on the mini-budget, the same can't be said for his colleagues on the front bench.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've made the position extremely clear And what is very clear is that we actually left the current government with an excellent inheritance, in as much as... where's it all gone now? Where's it all gone? We left the party opposite with the fastest growing economy in the G7. We left the party opposite with a near record level of employment. We left the party opposite with a near record low level of unemployment. We left the party opposite with 13 consecutive months of real wage growth. And we left the party opposite with inflation having come down due to the Ukraine war, come down from over 11% in October 22 right down to 2% and bang on target on the day of the general election. That is a decent inheritance. It has taken the party opposite 7 short months to completely trash it. So we'll take no lectures from the party opposite. But we, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, would do things very differently. And the reason we would be doing things differently is we recognise that small businesses, family businesses, are the backbone of our economy. They are the life and fire of our economy. But there is no life or fire in the Chancellor, just tragic mistakes and miscalculations. The sugar rush of borrowing and spending that we saw in the last budget, further bloating the size of the state, forcing taxes ever upwards. The failure to grasp the nettle of productivity, giving in to those trade union paymasters, above inflationary wage settlements with no strings attached whatsoever, and absolutely nothing to say from the party opposite on the issue of welfare, the budget for which has been ballooning out of control. When we were in government, Madam Deputy Speaker, when we were in, I will in a moment, we reduced the welfare budget on my watch by £5 billion, and the OBR scored over 400,000 fewer people going on to long-term sickness and disability benefits as a result of the reforms that we brought in. But there was more to be delivered. We went into the last election with a clear plan to save a further £12 billion every year as a result of our welfare reforms. But where has the zeal for welfare reform gone from the government opposite? It's evaporated entirely. In fact, it was never there. And I will just simply say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that if this government has the backbone to come forward with some serious proposals to deal with the welfare budget, such that on March the 26th the Chancellor can come to that dispatch box in this House and say that she is unwinding those national insurance increases, then the opposition will support her. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I notice that the motion today is on family businesses, Madam Deputy Speaker, but 96% of them are either ones with no employees or a very small number, unaffected, if not helped by the doubling of the employment allowance. Only 4% of family businesses have claimed BPR, most of them unaffected. And the Shadow Chancellor can't name a single proposal in the Employment Rights Bill. Will he apologise to family businesses for the total irrelevance of his complaints today to the theme that we're talking?
I think the honourable gentleman, with great respect, should get out a bit more and speak to some of those businesses. Madam Deputy Speaker, politics is about priorities. And for all their talk of being the natural party of business, the government is instead simply reaching for the socialist comfort blanket of tax, spend, borrow and regulate. It hasn't worked before. It isn't working now. And it will never work. And is not the truth, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this government is totally out of its depth, that businesses are reeling, and that we are all paying the price?
The question is as on the order paper, and I call the Minister, James Murray.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and my thanks to the Shadow Chancellor, the Right Honourable Member for Central Devon, for opening today's debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, the opposition, in their motion today, have set out a list of objections they have to decisions the government has taken, or, in the case of the measurements around pints, decisions that shadow ministers seem to have entirely imagined. While shadow ministers may be able to list their objections, they are unable to take responsibility for the damage to our economy that they in government were responsible for. And crucially, Madam Deputy Speaker, They are unable to offer any credible alternative. Today's motion makes clearer than ever that the Conservatives have no vision, no ideas, and no plan to deliver the change that our country needs. In contrast, Labour is the party with a plan for change, a plan to restore economic stability, boost investment and drive growth across the UK to put more money in people's pockets. We know that it is government's responsibility to provide stability, security, fiscal responsibility and to get unnecessary regulation out of the way when it stands in the way of growth. It is businesses, large and small, including family businesses and their workforces, who will create jobs and wealth and be the engines of growth in the economy. We know that pubs, shops, traders and services across the country not only play an important role in all our lives, but also drive economic growth. Those businesses and their workforces are the backbone of our economy, and they need a government who will take the right decisions, even when they are difficult, in the national interest to support our security and prosperity. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me start by briefly reminding the Conservative members opposite of the context in which those decisions have been made. That context is, of course, the inheritance that this country faced after 14 years of the party opposite being in power. I'll give way.
2010, the then government had to borrow £158 billion. Of course, fast forward another decade, we had something called the pandemic, where we had to borrow £400 billion. So on the top of that, collectively, that's a great big difficulty to be dealing with. Now, I sat in this chamber 5 years ago, when the pandemic happened, listening to all the interventions asking for more spending of money. This is the problem that the Conservative government have dealt with. Does he not agree?
The honourable gentleman said we had something called the pandemic. We also had a Prime Minister called Liz Truss, and that had a pretty big impact on our economy. And I know the Shadow Chancellor is distancing himself from it. I would welcome an intervention from his colleagues if they would like to leap to Liz Truss's defence. I'll give way. No, they're not seeking to intervene on me. Funny that, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no intention to intervene on me there. Perhaps in closing, one of the other shadow ministers can refer to Liz Truss's record and defend that. Yes, Liz Truss's record.
So the way I see it, the problem with Liz Truss with her budget was she didn't set out her workings. The problem with Rachel Reeves's one is she did, and the country and the world doesn't believe it. That is far more detrimental to the situation we find ourselves in, because she can't get out of that problem. That is the difference between Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves.
Wow, Madam Deputy Speaker. I should let the honourable gentleman intervene more often if he's going to say that the only problem with Liz Truss is that she didn't set out her workings. I think the problem was rather more fundamental than that, as people across this country will attest. But frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is no wonder that members opposite want to bury their heads in the sand and try and pretend the last 14 years did not happen. It was 14 years of mismanagement and decline, along with jolts of disaster, digging ever deeper holes in our public services and our economic resilience. It was their decisions that led to their resounding electoral loss last year, and it was their record in office that made the difficult decisions that we had to face on entering government necessary. I'll give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and he's in his usual courteous way handling this debate. But can I take him back to something that he said in his remarks, which were the hospitality businesses and pubs deliver economic growth? Can I say to him that there is a small pub chain in my constituency that are having to find a third of their total turnover because of the actions of this government, meaning that they may have to close a venue which supports a small village in my constituency? Is that the economic growth that he thinks that he's delivering?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and with regards to the changes around employer national insurance, which I assume is what he was referring to, I'll come to that in a few moments in my remarks. But let me be absolutely clear about the context here, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is that no responsible government could have let things carry on the way they were. Absolutely. That was simply not a tenable situation, and I think members of the opposite party know that. And that is why, at autumn budget, we took difficult but necessary decisions on welfare, spending and tax. And those decisions were vital steps towards restoring economic stability, fixing the public finances and supporting public finances. Now, as I said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst members opposite have taken every opportunity to say they oppose these choices, they have yet to offer any solutions of their own. but difficult decisions were necessary. And so let me set out why we made some of the choices that we did. I'll give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Labour Party manifesto said that by the year 28-29, they would increase spending by £9.5 billion a year. Why then did the budget increase it by that year by £76 billion, 8 times more than the Labour manifesto said?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I'm sure the honourable member will know, upon entering government and speaking to Treasury officials about the state of the public finances, we uncovered a £22 billion black hole, which was known to shadow ministers, well, ministers at the time, but the OBR was not informed about. I'll give way one more time.
The Minister might have noticed that there is a bigger gap between £9.5 billion and £76 billion than £22 billion. His answer was clearly ridiculous. The reason that we're talking about these kinds of tax rises is not because of the £22 billion fictional black hole, but because of the decision to increase spending by 8 times more than the Labour Party promised at the election. Will he accept that or not?
Yeah. So the honourable member's comments are clearly ridiculous. If he thinks a £22 billion black hole was fictional, it has a real-term consequences in terms of the pressure. I'm going to make some progress. I've been very generous in giving way to the honourable gentleman, but he will know that his colleagues on his benches who are in government were aware of the in-year spending pressures, and they chose not to share it with the Office of Budget Responsibility and thereby not share it with the British people. That is the truth of what we inherited, and that is why we had to take difficult decisions. Now, I'm going to turn to some of those difficult decisions which we had to take in the budget last year, because the opposition motion refers to the decisions we have taken on business property relief. Now, I assure him that the decision we took on this relief and on agricultural property relief were not taken lightly. The government recognises the role that these reliefs play, particularly in supporting small farms and family businesses, and that is why we chose to maintain these reliefs rather than abolishing them, meaning they maintain very significant levels of relief from inheritance tax beyond what is available to others. Indeed, the reliefs will remain more generous than the last time they were changed. The changes we are making mean that agricultural and business property reliefs will be better targeted and fairer. Madam Deputy Speaker, according to the most recent data from HMRC, 40% of agricultural property relief benefits the top 7% of estates making claim. It is a similar picture for business property relief, where more than 50% of business property relief is claimed by just 4% of estates making claims. These data bear out the fact that the benefit of the existing 100% relief on business and agricultural assets has become heavily skewed towards the wealthiest estates. It is neither fair nor sustainable to maintain such a large tax break for such a small number of the wealthiest claimants, particularly in light of the wider pressures on the public finances. And that is why we are changing how we target agricultural property relief and business property relief from April next year. Individuals will still benefit from the 100% relief for the first £1 million of combined business and agricultural assets. On top of this amount, there will be 50% relief, which means that inheritance tax will be paid at a reduced effective rate of up to 20% rather than the standard 40%. And of course, this sits on top of the other spousal exemption and nil rate bans which apply more widely within the inheritance tax system.
Kilnside Farm in my constituency, run by Bob Milton, is only 36 acres in total, which is a tiny farm, yet is going to be subject to these new taxes. So how can he say that only 4% are going to be affected? Even the smallest farms in my constituency are going to be hit by this.
Well, just to correct the honourable gentleman, I didn't say that only 4% were going to be affected. We set out that around up to 520 estates claiming agricultural property relief, including those that also claim business property relief, are expected to be affected in 26-27. That means that around 3/4 of estates will be unaffected and will not pay any more inheritance tax. All of the data on this has been set out in a letter from the Chancellor to the Treasury Select Committee, and if the honourable gentleman looks at that document, he'll see some of the stats that I'm referring to. I'll give way.
Of those 500 or so that you've just explained will be the ones that have to pay this inheritance tax, do you have any idea what the number of those are small businesses compared to the large estates that you're seeking to challenge in this legislation?
The data that I refer to is based on claims data, and this is an important point which comes up frequently when we have debates around agricultural property relief and business property relief, because if one were to consider assets that are owned by farmers or by other business owners, the actual value of the asset doesn't give you a guide to what claim might be made against inheritance tax, because that will depend on the ownership structure, on debt that might be owned, on what inheritances have happened earlier in people's lives, and so on. So the only data which can give you an indication about what impact these changes will be having from April 2026 is the claims data. Now, the data that I referred to earlier and that I referred to in response to the Honourable Gentleman is the claims data that HMRC has, real claims data. That is the data on which we made decisions around this policy, and that is the data which informs some of the Chancellor's statistics in her response to the Treasury Select Committee, which the Honourable Lady may like to consult. I'll give way.
I thank the Honourable Man for giving way. In Northern Ireland, the Agriculture Department has indicated that almost half the farms will be impacted by the inheritance tax. 75% of all dairy farms will be impacted by the inheritance tax. When will he start to speak with and listen to industry leaders? Because quite frankly, the meeting last week was an outrage, and he needs to sit and listen to industry leaders who know the industry and who are speaking on behalf of real farmers on the ground who are going to be impacted by this inheritance tax.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady referred to meetings that I held last week with representatives both of UK-wide organisations and indeed those that represent other nations within the UK. And I think there is a difference between listening to people and having to agree, because sometimes we listen and we disagree. Sometimes we listen and we disagree, and that is the situation that we found ourselves in after that meeting, where we listened to concerns but we have a different approach. And I've been setting out today through this debate exactly why we've taken the decisions that we have. I'll give way.
For giving way. I recently did a survey of all the farms in my constituency of South Devon, and 85% of the people who responded to that survey said that they were going to be affected by this inheritance tax, mainly because of the cost of land in South Devon. Practically all farms are going to be subject to this. Yeah. So when will the government listen to this evidence that we are collecting from our farmers, that your assessment that only 25% of farms are going to be affected is actually not correct?
Well, thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, but I think it is important to emphasise that the correct data to work out the impact these changes will have is the claims data, and the claims data is what is available to HMRC, and that is the basis on which we have established how many farms, how many assets, how many estates are likely to be affected by the changes. I will take one more intervention from the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. I think the point that, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we're trying to make is that by only looking at one data set, the challenge here is that the Minister is not looking at the big picture. We've spoken a lot about farmers, but the business property relief is about the whole of the business community. And so will he not go away and have another look at this and take account of all the evidence that hopefully he's been listening to since the announcement of this reckless policy?
Just for members who haven't understood etiquette, you can't just wander into a debate when someone's on their feet and then try and intervene. You need to take part in the whole debate. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll return to the point that I've made several times today, which is that the way to understand how a policy in relation to agricultural property relief and business property relief will work is to look at actual claims data, because that is how to understand the claims as they relate to individual estates. The overall value of farms or the overall value of businesses do not tell you exactly what the estate value is going to be through an individual claim, and that is the correct way to approach it. I'm going to make some progress because I've given way many times on this particular section of the speech, and I have plenty more to get through. I'm sure there are other members who would like to contribute in this speech. Madam Deputy Speaker, depending on people's individual circumstances, a couple will be able to pass on up to £3 million to their children or grandchildren, free of any inheritance tax at all. If owners pass on their assets more than 7 years before death, then no inheritance tax will be due either, and where any payment is due, this can be paid over 10 years interest-free in most circumstances. This stands as a benefit that is not seen anywhere else in the inheritance tax system. Now, I recognise, Madam Deputy Speaker, as evidenced today, that the reforms to inheritance tax generate strong views. But reform of these views is necessary given the fiscal challenge which confronts us, and this is a fair approach that helps put the public finances back on a sustainable footing. I'm going to make some progress. I'm going to move on, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, to some other elements of the motion which is put before us today around the changes to employer national insurance contributions, which is another of the difficult decisions we had to take about the budget. Now, I recognise that this change will have impacts, but asking employers to contribute more is the fairest way to restore fiscal stability and to provide essential services like our NHS with the resources they desperately need. The rate of employer national insurance will increase from 13.8% to 15%, whilst the per-employee threshold at which employers start to pay national insurance, known as the secondary threshold, will be reduced to £5,000. At the same time, we firmly recognise the importance of small businesses, and we will protect the smallest businesses and charities by more than doubling the employment allowance to £10,500. This means that next year, 865,000 employers will pay no national insurance contributions at all. More than half of employers will see no change or gain overall from this package. And employers will be able to employ up to 4 full-time workers on the national living wage and pay no employer national insurance contributions. Employers will, of course, also be able to benefit from other employer national insurance contributions reliefs, including hiring under 21s and under 25 apprentices where eligible. These changes broadly return national insurance contribution revenues as a proportion of GDP to the level they were before the previous government's cuts to employee and self-employed national insurance, but they do so